Now, today, I want to talk about effective cost control and reduction. And being a consultant, I obviously love a stepped process. And in this case, we're talking about 4 different steps. The first one, when I talk about cost control, I quite often get the feedback from the audience that cost control is important, but it's not the only important thing. So the first step is actually to ascertain the importance of cost control with your stakeholders and really making sure that you're aligned with them. I do know in procurement circles, there is a sort of an overemphasis on the other benefits that we deliver, such as sustainability, such as great relationships, obviously now also risk mitigation. But for stakeholders, even more so in this recovery from COVID, spend and cost have most certainly a very important, very high importance. And to get on the same page is the first part of effective cost control and reduction. Not just during the sourcing stage, but then also during the sustaining stage and maintenance stage of those savings, because quite often that is the main goal, the main domain of the business, to then manage the suppliers and their relationships over years. And if all of the value that you generated through the sourcing stage has eroded by then, what was the point of generating them in the first place, right? So the second stage then is around identifying opportunities, and this is where the 4 spend levers come in, and we'll talk about pay less, buy cheaper, buy less, and buy smarter at this stage. We'll then thirdly talk about how to validate and prioritize any opportunities you may have identified. Again, we don't want to focus on where it's not worthwhile focusing on, because we all just have a small amount of time available, so we may as well focus where it has the biggest impact. And then in the delivery stage, we'll deep dive today into the professional services and just see how the 4 spend levers could work within professional services categories, and what sort of to keep in mind when addressing spend in those. So let me talk about that, ascertaining the importance of costs and associated savings first. When we look at procurement and its sort of remit within an organization, first and foremost, procurement, like any other organization, like any other function in the organization, should be there to deliver against strategic objectives of the business, right? So there's a business plan, there's a strategy, and procurement should be aligned with that. Otherwise, we're operating in silos, and ultimately we're not generating any value. The second important part of procurement is also delivering cost savings. And what this matrix here sort of shows is, ideally we want to get to yes on both axes, right? We want to deliver against the strategic objectives of the business, and we also want to deliver cost savings, because then we're really a generator of profit. Against delivering against the strategic objectives, that is revenue related, and against cost savings is obviously cost related. So therefore, that's the panacea where procurement wants to be as a profit generator, and it's also where the fun is. However, what we see time and time again is that from stakeholders, it is very important that we can deliver on cost savings, and quite often being able to drive cost out is the ticket to play for procurement teams. That is how we normally gain the trust of stakeholders and get them to see that we can contribute to the business and to the bottom line of the business. Often secondary sort of objectives such as sustainability, modern slavery, and all of that is it is what it is. It is a secondary objective, if we like it or not. We might disagree with that, but for stakeholders, it is a nice to have. Whereas the cost savings is still the ticket to play, and you can see at the insert on the bottom right here of this slide. Cost reduction was the top priority for organizations, for 20% of the private sector organizations that replied to our research that I presented just an hour ago. So that's in the private sector, but in the public sector, it's almost 1 in 3. And that is probably the surprising part. There's a notion that in public sector, cost savings are not that important, but there is an expectation on procurement teams, especially in this post-pandemic world, to support fiscal repair and therefore to drive savings. Now, in the session prior, I was actually posting a link just to see how today this sort of focus is. So those other ones were just in March, and this is sort of the live report from that survey link that I posted an hour ago, and we'll post it again for you to participate as well. So 11 people have participated today, and 5 of those 11 said their cost reduction is important. And I asked also in 6 months' time, how will that be important? And even more. So in this case, 6 out of 11 say that it is the top priority in 6 months' time as well. So if you like it or not, cost reduction is here to stay as a top priority for procurement teams. So how do we go about identifying savings? The methodology that we use for that is, we call it the 4 spend levers. And they are explained on this slide. Now, the first one that you have is to pay less. And really, this is around using your spending power to beat down prices. So it is around consolidating the spend across your business and then tendering that or competitively quoting that with a couple of suppliers, and then reducing the amount of suppliers that deliver services within that specific category. It is typically what procurement does, what procurement has always done, and it's what procurement has a lot of control over. Today, I want to focus more on the other 3 spend levers: the buy cheaper, the buy smarter, and the buy less. So in the pandemic, buying less, especially in some categories, has become quite prominent. So reducing consumption of goods and services, such as, if you work from home, you just don't need as much facilities management. You don't need as big of an office, so you're saving on rent. There's virtual meetings that are happening, and the travel costs are down through sort of less demand. That works also in a non-COVID world, and influencing the demand has always helped reducing cost. Secondly, the buy cheaper. And buy cheaper is something where we need to manage the behavior for the people on the ground in the business units that are buying our goods and services. Quite often they've got a view that only gold-plated will do, especially when it is sort of going into the end products or the services that our customers experience. So we need to work with them to understand, is that really needed or not? And that is hard. So having a conversation around avoiding buying something that is a gold-plated service or a good, and instead making an argument we need to buy fit for purpose, is a hard conversation to have with the business, and it's one that is not in our control. Buying smarter is to find new solutions and ways in how to improve the way the good and the service is consumed within the organization. So there could be something where we might even have to spend more on one part of our value chain to reduce the cost of another. For example, if you're providing a service that customers are not happy with in the end, they will call your call center a whole lot. So you might have to invest in better products, better services, better customer experience in order to decrease the number of phone calls that you get in your call center. And that would be a buy smarter spend lever. So overall, what we see works really well is if you use as many of these spend levers in as many categories as you possibly can. What we saw in our study last year is that not all organizations use all of the spend levers equally. So the pay less, the traditional seeking competitive quotes and tenders and negotiating to beat prices down, is something that is used most often. 45% of organizations use that. An almost equal amount of organizations realized savings last year through reducing demand. And we can probably argue that that is a bit external to the procurement function quite often, because that demand for travel was reduced to no sort of specific intervention of procurement. Buy cheaper and buy smarter are really small. So not a lot of organizations use that at the moment. And that is something that I think is important to keep in mind when you sort of plan of where your savings will come from in the future. That's what we see here, the impact of each of those spend levers on cost. So how much does each of the spend lever reduce the cost base? We see the buy less obviously has a very high impact if you don't buy it in the first place. That's always going to reduce your cost the most. If you have interventions around buy smarter and buy cheaper, they have a medium impact on cost, often generating about 10 to 15% of savings. And the pay less spend lever is the one that has the lowest impact on cost. There's diminishing returns from running yet another tender process. So the first time round, you're aggregating spend and you run a competitive process, that's probably when you save money. But if you do that the third or the fourth time, there's really diminishing returns to that. So the impact on cost of the pay less spend lever is quite low. A difficulty of using the spend levers is also different for each of those. So first of all, the one that is very easy to use is the pay less, because it's often in the control of the immediate procurement team. You can make a decision to go out to tender. You can negotiate with providers externally, and that's really easy to do. Apologies. What is hard is using the other three spend levers, because they require a certain level of influence over your stakeholders. Only the stakeholders can help you realize those savings from those other spend levers. Gosh. And especially in the buy smarter, where it is actually hard to see how to even identify those opportunities, and you need to work very closely with your stakeholders to get there. Champions in this space do well versus those that are laggards. So we see organizations that save not a whole lot as the laggards, and they are heavily focused on the pay less spend lever, versus the champions use all four spend levers more equally across all of the categories. So first of all, they use the pay less spend lever where they can, and then they also use the buy cheaper spend lever and the buy less spend lever, and that is even in the followers in between. That's sort of when that then sort of starts to occur as well. So the maturity of your cost control is sort of determined by how many of the spend levers you are using within each of the categories. Now, that's great, but that's a lot of effort and it takes a long time. So we need to make sure that we actually validate and prioritize our effort. And we do that again together with stakeholders, especially when it comes to those other three spend levers, those advanced spend levers. First of all, we want to confirm the objectives of the stakeholders. What are we actually trying to achieve, say, with our professional services spend? Is it beneficial to reduce the cost there? Is that quite risky? Let's not make any assumptions around the cost reduction is always positive and that risk reduction is always positive. So let's test those assumptions together with stakeholders. They can also help us validate our spend analysis. I know most of you won't be happy with your spend analysis and the state of your data, but stakeholders quite often have an intuitive view of what that spend actually is and whether it's value for money or not. So we can use that information from the stakeholders. And when I talk about stakeholders, that's internal as well as external. So the internal business owners will know about their spend. And then your suppliers obviously have a lot of information about your spend as well. So using that to validate your internal analysis is very important. Context is king. So understanding why we're buying certain things and why we're not buying other things will help you validate, for example, a buy cheaper spend lever, right? What really constitutes being fit for purpose versus gold-plated is nothing that you can get out of an EOI or running a tender process or something like that. It is really working with the market, but also with the internal stakeholders to understand that context that will make the difference. And then last but not least, you can use the gained insights to determine your opportunity score. And that opportunity score is something that you should be doing for each of the categories, probably for your top 5 suppliers. The bigger the opportunity, the higher the score. Here are some questions that we determined through our research about 2 years ago. It will help you sort of score each of the suppliers within a specific category. So you want to understand how important your business is to the supplier. You want to understand if you're buying fit for purpose or gold-plated services. You want to understand what the current performance of the supplier is, how long ago the last competitive quoting or tender process has happened. If there's a single supplier delivering those services across all business units, whether the demand will be going up or down for these goods and services, and if what is the competitiveness of the market, if there's many others that can also supply those goods and services. So those questions are aligned with the 4 spend levers, obviously, and they will really help you at a sort of a supplier basis to determine whether it's worthwhile addressing a spend with a specific supplier within a specific category or not. Moving on to the deliver stage. So this is really now when it goes into a deep dive into each of the categories to deliver savings together with stakeholders. So I want to talk about the professional services category. It is one of the ones that we've researched through our COVID-related research. We've asked, in this case, it was 41 responses in March 2021, how their professional services spend has developed over the last 12 months. And most of them are sort of in the bucket of, it hasn't really changed much. Then there's a few where the spend has actually increased. And then there is a lot on the right-hand side as well, where the spend has reduced by more than 30%. Let's unpack that a bit of how they got to achieving savings. So those of the respondents that answered yes, that there was a reduced spend, we asked how they went about reducing that spend. And we see that there were some negotiations with the existing providers, there was some seeking of competitive quotes, there was some consolidation of suppliers, and that is the pay less spend lever. And then there was some buying less, reduction of demand. And the question here is, in the purple call out, did they just get lucky? So what actually can the procurement team say that they've contributed to the reduction of the spend in the professional services category? Probably not much. It just went down because the business stopped buying, to no intervention of procurement at all. So what we want to make sure actually is, remember, the champions that drive the most savings use all 4 spend levers. And what we saw here is they only used the pay less and the buy less spend levers during the pandemic. So there is also the buy smarter and the buy cheaper. And in fact, the buy smarter in the professional services category can achieve between 10 and 15% additional savings. And the buy cheaper probably between 2 and 6% as well. That buy cheaper percentage is probably higher in other categories than it is in professional services, but there's a whole raft of opportunities that are available that are linked with that spend lever. So, making sure that we get the right level of seniority of a consultant, for example, will determine, of course, what the cost is in the end. Making sure that you're not asking for the same advice over and over again, which is in the buy smarter space and happens a lot in the legal profession, or in the legal subcategory, if you want to call it that. That has a huge impact on savings. So I do understand that in 2020, these interventions that we saw probably were the ones that were quick to do within procurement's control and therefore got the priority. Fair enough. For 2021, if you want to drive, or if you have to drive, additional savings in the professional services category, they won't come from yet another buy less event. They won't come from yet another sort of tendering process of another renegotiation. What they will come from is the buy cheaper and the buy smarter spend levers. So it's really important to look into those a bit creatively as well in each of the categories, coming up with ideas together with your stakeholders of how we can replace gold-plated with fit for purpose, and how we can just buy smarter to reduce the overall cost through addressing the way that goods and services are consumed. Yields a lot of extra savings. And then once you've done that, there's a sort of a template to fill in. So for each of the categories, you would want to get to a point where you have an overview of what your spend is, how many suppliers there are, how concentrated it is, what are the key opportunities, and then what are those 5 service providers in that category and what is the opportunity score, and then the comments would be around, whether we should address them or not. So that helps you with, again, communicating to the business what is the strategy within each of the category, and it gives you the plan of how to deliver the savings against each of the spend levers. Now, this is the end of the presentation. I am quite keen to sort of get your take on some of this as well. So I do want to understand what works for you in generating savings post-COVID. And again, we've got the QR code here that you can scan with your phone, or we also have the link here, and we'll post it in the chat as well. If you want to contribute to this survey, that'd be much appreciated. We'll share the results with you. It's only going to take 4 minutes. It's all multiple choice, and we'll donate $5 for a good cause as a thank you for you participating in the research. All right, that's the presentation.